As a professional historian, I like to think that people like me are the source of most people's information about the past of a state, but that's just not true.
That's Dr. Ben Johnson, a Texas-born historian who traces how this state's myths, movements, and contradictions have shaped not just the Lone Star State, but the entire country. In his book, Texas, An American History, he offers a story that's clear-eyed, deeply researched, and full of forgotten voices.
Texas is a place, it's a state, it's a political entity, but it's also kind of an idea that's circulated across the world. Apparently in Norway, Texas is like shorthand for kind of wild and out of control. So like a guy who drove a school bus and the kids were, I don't know what was up that day, but they were just bouncing off the walls. He gets off the bus and he's like, I was totally Texas on the bus today.
You'll also hear from historian and author Joleene Maddox Snider, a former professor whose writing helped shape the soul of this show. Her immersive narration carries us through the land, the myths, and the questions that define Texas. This is Lone Star Lore, and I'm your host, Matthew Thornton. In this show, we don't shy away from complexity. We walk straight into it.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star Lore.
Texas. Say the word, and it stirs something. Pride, controversy, myth, memory. Today we begin with a question that lingers beneath every myth, every memory, every dusty mile of this state. What is Texas really? Let's begin with Joleene.
It is about 6:15 on a crisp, clear Saturday night in Austin, Texas. The truly faithful started arriving at Darrell K. Royal Memorial Stadium around 5 o'clock for the 7 o'clock kickoff. So the stadium is starting to fill with the over 100,000 fans it holds for this event. It is still daylight, so it is possible to see the university's iconic tower on the west side of the stadium. If the football gods favor the Longhorns, the tower will be washed in burnt orange light after a winning evening. The first serious cool spell came through Central Texas 2 days earlier, leaving the atmosphere dry and cool enough to need a jacket or sweater. Nearly all in the burnt orange and white colors of the University of Texas. By halftime, a full moon will illuminate all of Austin, the state's capital. This event defines what it means to be a Texan. Pre-game festivities are so ritualistic as to seem a part of one's Texas soul. The Longhorn Band leaves the Fine Arts Building across the street from the north entrance to the stadium and marches over and into the stadium. Hundreds of people gather in the stadium entrance to cheer them in and give the hook 'em horn sign that toddlers of Longhorn fans learn sometimes before they are even old enough to walk or talk. The noise is deafening for a newbie. It will get much louder in the stands. On the field, the show band of the Southwest marches in, clad in their burnt orange and white uniforms. Then comes Big Bertha, one of the two largest football game day drums in America. Smokey the Cannon is now on the sidelines, ready to be fired by the Texas Cowboys at every score the Longhorns make. The giant Texas flag is being spread out across the north end of the football field. It spans most of the space from sideline to sideline and about from the goal line to the 30-yard line. It is held by students along all four sides. Then the students holding one side run under the flag to the other side, while their counterparts run along the side and over them, turning this massive piece of cloth in reverse. It is a maneuver to behold. Also, even after doing this dozens of times over the years, now and then a few students get caught under the flag and form small lumps in places. The sound in the stadium increases as all the seats begin to fill. Then the music starts, the Texas fight song and the national anthem. And no Texas game is complete without the unofficial state anthem, The Eyes of Texas. On the game nearest Veterans Day, the Air Force does a flyover with 4 jet fighter planes, so close together they almost seem to be touching. If you happen to be on the upper deck on the west side, you feel and see America's military might in a way you won't in many other places than here on this yearly occasion. On the other end of the field, Bevo, the Longhorn mascot of the team, has arrived and is in his pen. The name Bevo sounds so cuddly. Nothing cozy and cuddly about this beast. He weighs about a ton. His horns span a distance of about 6 feet, and he bears the burnt orange markings on white, characteristic of his breed. It is game day on the 40 acres, and the Texas Longhorns are about to take the field. Welcome to Texas.
What Joleene captures in that scene, that's Texas in motion. But how do we get here? And what are we holding on to when we cheer, remember, or reminisce? That's where Ben Johnson comes in. His new book, Texas, An American History, was first pitched to him by a Connecticut editor who wanted to understand Texas. Not cowboys or cattle drives, but the place as it is now, suburban, sprawling, and still somehow mythic.
You know, there's been a lot written about Texas, right? And I'm really grateful for that, and certainly couldn't have written this book without that huge body of work, right? I mean, really, for almost 200 years, people have been writing about Texas. But I had the sense that it didn't, a lot of that was really focused on the 19th century and focused on the countryside. And, you know, I grew up in Houston. I taught at SMU for 9 years. You know, most of us were like everywhere else in the country, right? We were from cities and suburbs, and our parents worked for, you know, a school system or an accounting company or a big oil company. When I was at SMU, the guy who was hired as our Middle Eastern historian came from Turkey, and he grew up watching the soap opera Dallas. It was one of the few things on the one television channel that they had in his childhood in Turkey. And so he had a strong sense of what Texas was supposed to be about.
When a Connecticut editor asks what Texas is, or a kid in Turkey watches Dallas and thinks that's the whole story, the myths start to feel louder than the facts. So Ben wrote a book to cut through the noise and tell something truer. But before we start peeling back the myth, Joe brings us in with the words of another outsider.
John Steinbeck wrote about the state, quote, "Texas is a state of mind. Texas is an obsession. Above all, Texas is a nation in every sense of the word," unquote. Go about anywhere in the world, mention you are from Texas, and you will get a reaction. The world knows Texas. Why? Is it the size, the reputation, the arrogance and braggadocio of its citizens, the underlying taint of violence and racism, the colorful history, the memorable men and women that have made the state? Yes, all these things and more. Maybe it is the combination, the stirring of the state soup that blends all these things together in just the right way to produce Texas.
Joe vividly shows us how Texas is more than a place, but rather seems to thrive as a blend of forces and stories. But how did that blend give rise to the Texas we imagine? To unpack that, I asked Ben to delve into the myths that shape our view of this larger-than-life state.
I mean, I think of the myth of Texas as being that it's this kind of larger-than-life, sort of swaggering, ass-kicking place that's not the same as the rest of the United States, even though it's, you know, obviously a part of the United States and proudly American, and that it has its own history that's different than the rest of the country, and that in fact it used to be an independent country, and that it's particularly tied to a set of events and in the 19th century, and it kind of starts with people like Stephen F. Austin and white Americans like my ancestors coming into Texas in the 1820s and 1830s and ending up being oppressed by the Mexican government and starting a revolution, which really had no chance of success, no real chance of success, right? Tiny, maybe 30, 40,000 people up against a country of 17 million. And then shockingly, they win. They become a republic. Somehow they join the United States. You kind of skip over how or why that might have happened. And then does amazing things with cattle and the ranching industry across North America, and end up discovering oil. And, so there's some big changes there, but this kind of larger than life persona and this kind of swagger continues. And then I think the myth, it ends in the 19th century, or if it continues up until modern times, it's only things like if you're a rancher, you're still a part of that myth, or if you're an oil guy, Dallas, which we've talked about.
And the Cowboys and all of that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The Cowboys. So it's meant to invoke those things, the Texas Rangers. I mean, even the sports teams kind of do that, right? The Dallas Mavericks.
Yep.
Like a lot of myths, it's stuck around because it captures some truths and it captures some things that are really important to people. I mean, I think the story of the Texas Revolution and the Alamo, which is known across the world. When I am in Spain in college and I tell the guy in the hostel that I'm from Texas, he's super excited and asks me, ¿Cuántos rojos has matado? How many Redskins have you killed? And asks me about how many horses my family has. And then I try to explain to him, my dad's an accountant. My mom has a library science degree. We live in a city and, we drive a Honda and it just doesn't, but still
it's not matching his myth. It's not matching his myth.
So immediately we're seeing the limits of it. But what it does do is like explain to me, wow, like there is something distinctive that comes with me as a Texan that leads to this conversation that wouldn't be happening if I told the guy I was from Ohio.
Ben's insights into Texas myth show why we imagine the Lone Star State the way we do. But to see why those stories took root, we must return to Texas's very beginnings. Here's Joleene.
In order to truly understand Texas, you have to understand the land and the history as the two halves of a whole. First, the size. It is a gigantic landmass. Nearly 172 million acres. By all rights of geography and logic, it should have been 3 or 4 states. But Texas would have none of that diminutization. The future state became a republic in 1836 when it won a revolution from Mexico. It wasn't that Texans didn't want to be in the Union, but her status as a slave state was not acceptable in the North, where the abolitionist movement had gathered steam. Another slave state would only entrench the South's, quote, peculiar institution further into the national reality and psyche and make the South's power and prestige greater than it already was. Because of the devil's bargains that the founders believed were necessary to gain unity of the colonies and ratification of the Constitution, they codified slavery into the document as the law of the land. The 3/5 Compromise, which called for the counting of 3/5 of the enslaved population for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. The American South had an undue power in Congress, and it was a power derived from the ownership of human flesh. So admitting Texas would further enhance Southern power and add another slave state to the roster. It wasn't until 1845 in the election of expansionist President James K. Polk that Texas came into the Union. By the time Texas joined the Union, her government and politics were, to use a modern phrase, a hot mess. It is nearly impossible to understate how really profound the dysfunction and turmoil was. During its 9-year period as a republic, the state had piled up a debt of almost $10 million. That's a shade over $420 million now. Even by Texas standards, that is a chunk of change. The state hoped to use its public lands as a source of revenue to reduce and or eliminate their obligations. Ultimately, the federal government would end up paying off the Texas debt, partly as part of the Compromise of 1850 and later legislation, But not until 1881 was the Texas debt fully funded. The Texas Republic's debt problem was largely the result of constantly dealing with frontier battles and raids by native tribes in the western and northern parts of her land, and by Mexico, the Republic's former owners from the South. Texas independence from Mexico was a fragile thing until after Texas joined the Union. The entire 9 years between the victorious conclusion of the Battle of San Jacinto and entrance into the United States of America was fraught with constant fear of Mexican invasions.
There's real irony at the heart of Texas's origin story. In 1821, newly independent Mexico embraced the maxim to govern is to populate, opening its northeastern frontier to Anglo settlers as a human buffer against relentless Comanche raids. By 1828, General Manuel Terán warned in his famous report that these settlers already outnumbered Mexicans and remained perfectly indifferent to Mexican laws, language, and religion. Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829, only to carve out exemptions for its impresarios, allowing American families to bring enslaved people into Texas. In 1830, Congress passed the law of April 6th to halt further U.S. immigration and ban slavery outright. But lax enforcement and pre-existing land grant contracts rendered the law toothless. English became the dominant tongue, American customs took root, and many settlers never fully embraced Mexican citizenship or its laws. In effect, Terán's warnings went unheeded, and Mexico's own policies ceded control of its northern province, today's Texas, to the very immigrants it had invited. I asked Ben Johnson about the irony regarding this sordid history and how our long, porous border has shaped Texas history in ways we still feel today.
You know, to me, the point of studying the past is to understand the world that I live in. One of the most important factors in the overall history of the United States, and even more so in Texas, is that we have a long and porous border with Latin America, and that has not been a part of the way we've told our history. But boy, if we want to understand where we are in 2020, in the 2020s, I think we sure need to do that. But I think your question really gets at one of the other dynamics, right? Which is, I think a lot of Americans forget that we, U.S. citizens, are the ones who are mobile and going to other places, sometimes invited and welcomed, and sometimes not. But, even if you think about the hundreds of thousands of American retirees in places like Mexico and Ecuador, this is not a story that's over. I mean, I think it works in different ways. They're not generally trying to bring U.S. sovereignty or expand the borders of the country with them. But then actually, I think what a lot of people don't realize about people like Stephen F. Austin is that they weren't either, at least at first. They were moving around because there were certain kinds of opportunities there. They fit in very well in Mexico. And, Mexico is the United States. We often and particularly used to call ourselves a nation of immigrants, right? And to understand that, kind of attracting people from a wide range of far-flung countries was one of the things that had constituted the United States. I think we forget that that's also true of other countries, and actually Mexico is one of them, right? So, former Mexican President Vicente Fox. I mean, Fox is not an ancient Aztec surname. It's an Irish surname. You go to Monterrey, the capital of the Mexican Northeast and the home ground of some of its most important businesses and industrial companies. And, you drink beer from breweries that were established by German and Austrian and Alsatian immigrants. And the leading families, were originally, many of them from Ireland and England and France, and, came there and married in with all kinds of people. So our history is more complicated. Our history as, U.S. citizens is more complicated than we often think, but so are the histories of Mexico and other places.
Ben's point makes clear that Texas's past is inseparable from the broader currents of American and Mexican history, complicated, intertwined, and often surprising. To see how those early policies and conflicts shaped the republic itself, Let's return to Joleene Maddox Snider's immersive account of Texas's entry into the Union.
Being Texas, the Republic was not about to come into the Union like other territories had before her. No, Texas came into the Union by a joint resolution of Congress. She insisted on keeping all her public lands, the only state in the Union to do so. And that was a lot of land. It's that western half of Texas that gives the state so much of its mythical identity. It's the six-shooters, the cattle, the Indians, and the cowboys that gave the nation and the world the image most people have. But that wasn't Texas in 1845. When Texas joined the Union in 45, everything west of Austin was the Comanche country. The real Texas in the beginning was a continuation of the South. It got 30 to 60 inches of rain annually and boasted a rich, sandy loam soil that grew valuable cotton crops. The area was forested with dense trees and woods, perfect for felling and building cabins, houses, barns, stables, cotton gins, and whole towns. Most of the people had come from the southern states of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and the other southern sisters, and they brought their slaves with them. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, 1/3 of the Texas population was enslaved African Americans, and they nearly all lived east of the 100th meridian.
Joe's narrative just reminded us that fully 1/3 of Texans lived in bondage east of the 100th meridian, a fact that many of the state's historians believe is too often left out of the often preferred story of Texas. This led me into thinking about the controversial phrase, revisionist history.
So, yeah, I'm really glad you asked the question about revisionism. And I often hear it in political discourse from people who are pretty hostile to the world of colleges and universities. And the sense is it's almost like traitor. There was a truth and now someone's coming along and they're like messing with it for some reason. To professional historians, this is a word that carries a very different meaning. And it's almost redundant. If someone called me a revisionist historian, my reaction would be, well, just call me a historian, because what historians do is they revise our understandings of the past. They take what we think we know and examine it in the light of new evidence and new concepts and new ideas. It's like, would you call your doctor a revisionist because when you go in to see them, he doesn't drain your blood and put a leech on you and talk about your humors in the way that in the early 1800s he would have done, because that was medical science back then. No, we've learned things. We developed microscopes. We discovered the germ theory of disease. We developed antibiotics. In other words, to be a good doctor in 2025 is not the same thing as it was in 1975 or 1675. And if someone said, I practice medicine the old-fashioned way, like we did 300 years ago, and I don't pay any attention to all of this newfangled nonsense, that is not a doctor that I would want to go to. So it's not that I think historians today have figured everything out and the historians of the past had everything wrong. It's just that it's an inherently revisionist, adaptive, changing discipline. What happened in the past, the events that happened in the past don't change, but we learn new things about them and new ways of understanding them.
For today's historians, revisionism isn't about rewriting history. It's about telling the whole story, blemishes and all, from every perspective they can uncover.
By 1860, on the eve of when Texas joins the other states that secede from the United States, 1/3 of the population living in Texas is enslaved. So, we have some sense of what that means for 33% of the population. It also means that the wealthiest and most powerful people in the state have, almost without exception, that wealth and power comes from the ownership and the exploitation of the labor of other people. And it used to be, common for for more than a generation for, large groups of white Texans to grab black men accused of crimes, often with the flimsiest of evidence and with no due process whatsoever, publicly torture, mutilate, dismember, and display the body parts of their victim. I mean, this is a terrifying practice. So, I would never say, as a person, I never want to be reduced to my worst moments and judged as a whole only for my sins. But boy, practices like that, they're a part of our history too. And I can't abide any history and any mythos of Texas that doesn't take those kinds of things into account.
Anytime I encounter anyone who's willing to be honest about the flaws, even in them, whether it's themselves or their background or whatever, deeper history, I immediately trust them more.
I mean, I do think there is a way that people, particularly outside of Texas, just take those very real things and make them the entire history, right? And so you get a kind of pathological reading of Texas history. But that's also a kind of long story about Texas that is the kind of doppelganger or shadow of the sort of triumphalist Texas myth, is this story that I think starts with American abolitionists who viewed the Texas Revolution in the 1830s as a real conspiracy by slaveholders. They weren't entirely wrong, but they then portray Texas as this kind of outlandishly violent and larger than life place. They take a lot of the tropes of the myth of Texas and kind of give them a dark inflection. And, I think it's probably pretty clear to you from this conversation and from reading my book that, that doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't actually explain the reality of the place.
Ben makes clear that owning our full history means confronting its darkest chapters, but it doesn't require turning every account into a moral lecture or prescribing how we must judge the actions of ancestors. Good historians aren't concerned with painting the past as positive or negative. They're committed to uncovering the truth itself. We can accept our history without letting criticism dictate our emotions. With that balance in mind, let's turn to Jolene's sweeping portrait of Texas's vast landscapes.
Texas was unlike most other states that made up the United States of America. Only Texas bordered a foreign country to which it had formerly belonged and with which it still had contentious relationships. Additionally, no other state shared a border on the opposite side with a highly mobile, warlike native population that was hostile to what they saw as the takeover of their lands. And certainly no other state shared Texas's immensity. One has to travel the real Texas to understand what author Stephen Harrigan describes as the, quote, immensity of plains and prairies and broken escarpments, deserts, fertile river valleys, spectral forest, wild coastal marshes merging into the stormy waters of the Gulf of Mexico, unquote. By anyone's standards, it is huge. The old saying about Texas is fairly true. The sun has ris and the sun has set, and we is in Texas yet. To gain some perspective, when it is 8 a.m. in most every state in the Union, the sun shines with about as much intensity on the west side of the state as it does on the east side, where the sun first announces the coming of a new day. But not in Texas. It takes almost a full hour for the sun to cross the state. While the sun may be up and warming the earth in Beaumont, it is barely dawn near El Paso, but it is the same time in both places. It is not only the time, it is the differences in the land that astonishes even residents of Texas.
We've seen how Texas's myths and borders took shape. Now let's ask a different question. How has the land itself shaped Texas's story?
One of the other things I teach and study is actually the field of environmental history, which is, it's like the rest of history and explaining change over time and, how we got to be where we are today. But it takes seriously the idea that there are non-human actors in history, right? So things like the horse, right? Which when that gets reintroduced to North America, very different. You get very different kinds of cultures and civilizations. Or, God forbid I say this, like a virus, like COVID. Boy, that was a world historical force. When you're talking about Texas and you talk about a state history, that sounds small and boring, but it's on such a scale that it is really more like a national history, right? Texas is geographically bigger than most places, and it has such a diversity of landscapes from, the piney woods of East Texas to the Chihuahuan Desert out in South Texas, the high plains up in the Panhandle, the coastal plains in Chaparral, the enormous amount of land that's available for agriculture, particularly cotton, which in the 19th century, is like what petroleum becomes later. It is just this incredibly valuable worldwide commodity. And there's a reason why people call it white gold. In North America, it's associated with the institution of plantation slavery. So immediately you have the politics of slavery that comes with that, which aren't things that are driven by the natural landscape, but they're tied through cotton. Petroleum as another one. So by 1950, petroleum has been discovered and exploited in more than 80% of the counties of Texas. The modern history of Texas and Houston, where you and I both have roots, is really hard to conceive if it weren't for the random fact that there's a lot of dead dinosaurs that got turned into oil under the Texas landscape.
From cotton fields to oil wells, Texas's resources drove its politics and economy. But the real picture comes into view only when you cross its vast plains.
Start on the east side at Texarkana on Interstate 20. The land looks more like the rest of the southern states to which it is attached. It is green, lush, and reflects that more than 40 inches or so of rain it gets most years. Drive east through the metropolitan areas of Dallas and Fort Worth. You just drove through 2 of the 5 cities in Texas that make the list of the 10 largest cities in the country. By the time you get on the west side of Fort Worth, the land has become more open, more prairies, less green, not as tree-covered. The rainfall rates are down to about 25 inches of rain a year, if the citizens are lucky. It is not country that grows cotton, like the eastern side of the state. Corn, hay, and grasses to feed the cattle are about what most ranchers grow. Keep coming. You aren't even halfway across the state. By the time you get to Abilene, you are in deep West Texas. Lot of brown here. One visitor commented, quote, "I didn't know there were this many shades of brown," unquote. The land is fairly flat, not farmland at all. This is ranching country, or oil country. The pump jacks and rigs can nearly outnumber the cattle in some places. The rainfall is more scarce, maybe 20 inches in some places, and some of that can fall in sheets of rain. Frog stranglers, or what the locals call them. Some years it can be less than 5 inches for the entire year. Unless you are a genuine road warrior, it is time to start thinking about stopping for the night. Besides, it is another 2 hours to Big Spring, where there are hotels and motels. If you suffer under the delusion you are close to the Texas western border when you get to Big Spring, think again. It is nearly 5.5 hours to El Paso. You are far enough to understand why Texas buys more Cadillacs than any state in the nation. The cars are ostentatious, expensive, gas guzzlers, environmentally so bad you can almost see the ozone layer evaporating before you. But they carry Texans across these long stretches in more comfort than about anything else. Basically, they are living rooms on wheels.
Out here, geography funneled Texans down endless highways. But you notice they didn't load up in compacts, they loaded into Cadillacs, unapologetically grand. As Ben will explain, the land offers possibilities, but it's not the only precursor for the choices that reveal who we are.
Non-human forces and landscapes don't necessarily make people do things. We're not enslaved to them. Different cultures can find very different ways of living in the exact same landscape. So there is a dimension of human culture and human agency and human freedom. But I don't think there's any doubt that if you want to understand Texas, starting with a sense of geography and the landscape, makes a lot of sense to me.
Despite all that human ingenuity, Ben reminds us landscapes don't dictate our behavioral destiny, but they do tend to set the stage for the choices that are made within any given culture. With geography as our earliest guide, let's return to Jolene's immersive journey across the state.
The further you go, the drier, dustier, and lonelier the land looks. In the fall and winter, the tumbleweeds blow across the landscape. It can be a scary thing when some of those rolling balls of dead shrubbery hit your windshield at 70 miles an hour. It is easy to go 100 miles and not see a human inhabitant except for the drivers on the interstate. Bathrooms, eateries, and gas stations are far and few between. If there is a charging station for an EV auto, it would be akin to a wonder of the world. The rainfall rates can drop to nearly nothing for months at a time. If you start to feel like you are in a desert, you are right. Most of western Texas is part of the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion. Keep driving. Texans with children taking long trips like this are more likely to be driving Suburbans or similar vehicles. They are equipped with more to entertain kids. When you start to notice the rumblings of unrest and rebellion from the back seats, the driver can pop a DVD movie into the player on the dash and drop down the screen from the roof of the car. Veterans of these journeys will tell you to take a fresh box of vanilla wafers with you, but don't dare let them get carried to the back. Those wafers in a movie will get you another 100 miles down the road. When the stirrings of rebellion begin to claim your attention again, throw a handful of wafers over your shoulder. Repeat as needed. Oh, and don't forget to get a new box at the first pit stop. You are driving the state from east to west. The changes in land and ecosystems are just as extreme and jarring going north to south. No cheating. You can't call Wichita Falls the north border. You have to go up to the Panhandle to start the journey. Do stop and enjoy the Paladera Canyon. It is the second largest canyon in the country. It is also where Quanah Parker and his starving band of Quijada natives hid out until 1876, when they surrendered to the federal government and settled on the Oklahoma Reservation. As you drive south, remember you are driving through the Comanche. That area of Texas was not really habitable in a safe and secure manner until about the last 2 decades of the 19th century, on the cusp of the 20th century. Keep those vanilla wafers handy. It is still a long way to the coast. When you get south near the coast, head for Corpus Christi, Texas. Actually, it is another 5 hours to Brownsville and the Texas-Mexican border, where you really end your journey. But you can do that tomorrow. Right now, you have earned a special event, and the wafers have probably done all the magic they can. By now, you can smell the salt and feel the sea breeze. Go out to the Padre Island National Seashore. When you get to the visitor center, don't let your children run ahead of you. Keep them by your side. Go up the steps to the open-air pavilion and keep your heads down. Look at your feet and walk forward onto the deck. Near the middle, look up. The view of the Gulf of Mexico is priceless. That first look at the blue water and sky, the crystal white surf rolling in to the sands, is something you will remember for a lifetime. Just stand there and look at it for a few minutes and comprehend the fact that what you are looking at is the same as it was the day Cabeza de Vaca and his starving band struggled onto the Texas shore in 1528. Remember, while you digest the lovely view, and before the lure of the water or your kids drag you down the boardwalk and across the sand, where you have been, what you have seen, and how far you still have to go to see the geographic bottom of the state. And you are in Texas yet. This is how you begin to understand the magic and the mystery of Texas. You see it, you feel it, you taste it, you smell it, and most of all, you get to meet its people and learn its history.
Jolene's closing tour reminds us that Texas's vastness and complexity can't be captured by myth alone. So, I asked Ben to take a moment and reflect on the limits of those myths and the questions they leave unanswered.
So a couple things about this myth. It's really focused on the 19th century. Everything that happened before and everything that happened after is just kind of not addressed by the myth. And, there's a lot of things that happened since 1900 in Texas that were hugely consequential, including, 3 presidents who have come out of Texas. It's very rural. It's oriented at the countryside. And as we've talked about, most Texans today, and for really since about World War II, have lived in cities and suburbs. So it's just not talking about the place where they spend most of their time. And most of the characters in the myth, and definitely most of the good guys in the myth, are white. And Texas is, in the 21st century, a majority-minority place. The plurality of the population is of Mexican descent. And obviously, if you go back before the 1820s, that is certainly the case, right? It's indigenous. So there's a whole set of people's experiences that they're either not addressed by the myth, or they only show up in the myth as really pernicious things. And then finally, I think the myth, and this is one of the big points I try to make in the book, the myth is all about exceptionalism. It's all about Texas is over here. It's isolated from the rest of the world, or it's so different from the rest of the world. But to my mind, I'm really interested in the ways that Texas has influenced the rest of the world and influenced the rest of the country. How is it that you get people in Turkey watching Dallas when they grow up? How is it that a school bus driver in Norway uses Texas as a metaphor for crazy or out of control? How is it that the kind of ties between evangelical Christianity that you see, particularly in some prominent Dallas Christian congregations, and conservative politics aren't just confined to Texas, but have a huge impact nationally? And I think to begin to answer those questions, the myth is just not helpful. I mean, it's not that it needs to be attacked or debunked. It's just that you need to ask other questions and tell other stories.
We grow up deeply proud. A lot of Texans do. You do, I do. Without just completely taking the myth and throwing it away, how can we still have it be useful to some degree, or have a more honest, truthful version of history without eroding our pride,
Yeah, because, it's interesting how you put that question. I've never thought that as a historian, I could be powerful enough to erode somebody's pride. But Texans love Texas. I think that's another way to put that. And that's great, because when you love something, you're curious about it, you want to know more about it, and you care when you find out truths about it, even when those truths are not necessarily comforting.
Yeah. And that's another thing too, is it's I get to a point with, be it we're talking about Texas history, American history, modern politics, whatever it is, I don't care what the truth is so much as I just want to know it. I think that's when it gets hard, is whenever the love for a thing gets in the way of the truth. And obviously that's why I appreciate the kind of work that you've done and the candid nature to be able to speak to these things and say, look, it's not that it's good, bad, or otherwise. It's some of it's good, some of it's bad, and there's more. There's always more.
I hope that we get accounts of Texas that show how much it has been on the cutting edge of the United States and set the pace in a lot of ways for American society as a whole. I hope that the exceptionalism, the insistence that Texas is so different from the rest of the country, is actually replaced by the kind of reverse, that we're such a fundamental part of the making of the modern United States. And particularly, I hope that they look at the ways in which Texas became a modern, complicated, heterogeneous society.
Texas isn't just history, it's in today's headlines. On August 3rd, 2025, over 50 Democratic lawmakers fled to block a Republican-backed map that would likely add 5 GOP-leaning seats. In response, the House approved civil arrest warrants and $500 a day fines for each absent member, enforceable only within Texas, while Governor Abbott threatened to declare their seats vacant or treat fine payments as potential bribery. It's a high-stakes standoff, to say the least. You might find yourself asking, who's right? The answer depends on the lens you use. Quorum busting isn't new in Texas. Legislators did it in 2003, and even states like New York, Illinois, and California have echoed the tactic in solidarity. At its core, this clash pits the power of protest against the authority of institutions and reminds us that who draws the lines and who tells the story shapes not just Texas, but the country at large. A heartfelt thank you to Joleene Maddox Snider for her gift of language, bringing Texas's landscapes and legends to life, and to Dr. Ben Johnson for his clear-eyed insights into how Texas reflects the broader American story. Thank you for listening to our very first episode of Lone Star Lore. In this series, we'll continue guiding you beyond legend and into the heart of the Lone Star State, one story at a time. Thanks for listening.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star